I think we'll stop here and leave some room for questions. So I hope this was comprehensible in some way, and that you enjoyed the quotes as well. I think we can open the stage for questions. Mike, what do you say?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's been such a wonderful talk, so thank you. And we've got some lovely questions.
Yes. Juliette, please.
Hi, yeah, thank you for your talk. So I'm a psychiatry resident and I work in Toronto with mostly schizophrenia patients. And I'm often struck by how often their delusional content is really fixated on homosexuality, like on a fear of homosexuality or on imagined homosexual molestation and sensory experiences. And I'm often not sure what to make of it. And it's really striking. And I was also wondering, as a second question, if Freud ever addressed the heritability of schizophrenia or the phenomenon of, families where it's clear that multiple generations have psychotic experiences.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Great question. Very clear question. I enjoy clear questions. They're always better, for me at least. So here, again, this is a suggestion that I made earlier, but now I'll make it more explicitly. And this might be something that comes from the Lacanian orientation in general, is to distinguish the level of content from the level of structure. Yes. Linguistically, we would say the level of the signified in comparison to the level of the signifier. Right? We can see that in Freud. Freud pays a lot of attention to this level of the signifier. But how can we understand this in the terms that you were saying? Yes, we might see the content repeating in the delusions. And as you say, these questions of homosexuality and what we assume is that, well, the fact that the subject can speak about homosexuality in these terms has something to do with the, let's say, meaningful database that culture provides. Right? These ideas come from culture, and we see also in hallucinations in psychosis that they are they have a historical particularity. If once upon a time it was demons and witches, it's more about aliens, etc. And the internet, of course, nobody talked about the internet before. So this is the level of content. But we can identify a structural level below that, which could comply with different forms of content, which is contingent. It relies on an historical period. Now, what we see in this paradigm that Freud presents in terms of structure is he says that these delusions will always have something to do with a structural level that has to do with narcissism. Narcissism, not as we know it today, as this very common term, narcissistic personality disorder or whatever, but we're talking about a mode of libidinal functioning, a libido that is directed to the ego, and more correctly here, because it is a secondary narcissism, meaning a libido that has once been directed to objects, withdrawn from objects, and then is connected to objects again via the ego. Now, the question that we ask ourselves, what content can latch on to this type of drive functioning? What we treat in an analysis is the drive. We do not treat the content. It is not so interesting for us to give the subject different stories to tell about himself. The subject will find the right story for them. Right, but what we want is a story that will comply with a change, with a transmutation on the level of drive functioning. So this is what I have to say about your first question. Your second question, which is another excellent question of heritability. Look, this is something that I sort of insist on in many of my talks, and the fact that we have to be humble. I mean, as psychoanalysts, psychoanalysis is not the answer to everything in the universe. Psychoanalysis, in other terms, is not the discourse of all discourses. It is not a meta language that can explain everything. Psychoanalysis has its its weaknesses, its blind spots, but also has its strengths. And what I would say is that psychoanalysis is blind to the question of, let's say, the physiological cause. Psychoanalysis is not about that. There are many other fields of science that might engage with this question of hereditability, but the psychoanalytic discourse, well, it's not useful for that. Psychoanalysis begins when the subject is structured, when we are seeing a psychotic, a neurotic, a perverse, or if you ask me, an autistic subject, then psychoanalysis begins. And the question is not why this happens. The answer psychoanalytically is a subjective choice, right? But a choice that is to be taken a bit differently than the choice of that we make in the supermarket, yes? But what we see in the beginning is the formation of a subject, and then psychoanalysis asks itself, what can we do clinically, practically, to enable this subject, which is necessarily suffering. I mean, for Freud or for psychoanalysis, I think there is no healthy subject. There is no subject that is at one in harmony with the universe. Every subject is a result of a certain failure. And the question is, how can we assist this subject in living with this failure, in finding a way to maybe even make something singular of their own particular failure, a singular thing that will fill their life with a unique type of satisfaction and a type of freedom that can characterize only them. So this is what I have to say. Yes, of course, there is a hereditary factor, and it is investigated by other fields, but psychoanalysis is not about that. It is about, well, we have a psychotic subject. How do we work with this subject? How do we facilitate the treatment in order to bring this subject to a point where suffering is quite mundane and does not swallow his own whole reality? So I hope that's answering your question. And I think we have two more questions. So.
Leon, thank you for this. I have a question about psychosis as it relates to dreaming. I was just wondering if there's been any papers written or studies done on, like, I'm thinking if psychosis is a separate structure than like a neurosis, you know, even if someone doesn't suffer a psychotic break, would their dream landscapes be different? Would the object relations in the dreams be different?
Mm. Yes. Okay, this another good question, because Freud says that the dream is the golden road to the unconscious, right? A dream is already an interpretation of something that is relevant for the analysis. Here, I'll have to rely a little bit on Lacan reading Freud in order to answer your question, and say that, well, we can start with Freud. We see already in Freud that a distinction between neurosis and psychosis would be that neurotic subjects are affected by repression. More than that, we can say that repression proper, is the cause of neurosis. Yes? But psychotic patients, we say, do not get to the point of achieving this form of repression. Or in other words, psychotic subjects are less affected by repression. What this means is, and this is, I'm quoting Lacan here, is that the psychotic unconscious is like an open sky, à ciel ouvert. There is something that is more out on the surface in terms of the psychotic unconscious. And we see that in dreams. And I'll give you an example, and maybe I'll end with that. And again, I'm inviting all of the participants here to get in touch. If you have further questions, please get in touch. I'll be very happy to discuss these things with you. What we would see in terms of dreams when we engage with psychotic patients is that repression is less effective in dreams of psychotic patients. So for instance, there's this classic example from Freud's paper on negation, where the patient says to Freud, well, I dreamt about this woman, but it is not my mother. And Freud says, well, here we see naturally that there is a repression going on. So for a psychotic, the dream will be about the mother. And in the dream, the psychotic will in fact be having sex with the mother. For instance, this is just an example, not an actual clinical case. But the point is that repression will not be as strong and will be less effective in psychosis, and this will have effect on dream.
Hello. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I think I have two questions. So my first question would relate to what seems to me a bit paradoxical about repression, and even more about rejection or foreclosure. Because it seems to me that we talk about these operations as attempts to ignore or to avoid some representation or some idea. And paradoxically, I mean, in order to recognize these ideas as unacceptable, like, we need to recognize them first, so the subject knows what it is, and then attributes a certain value of acceptable or unacceptable idea. So how can we think about this paradox here? My second question is about psychosis and its relation to, for example, delusions or hallucinations. So as far as I understood, what makes a subject psychotic is not the hallucination or the symptom per se, but like the place it takes within a certain structure. So would that mean that it's possible to encounter neurotic subjects with hallucinations, for example? And if it's the case, if it's possible, how could we hear the difference between a psychotic and a neurotic subject when they tell us, for example, about voices they hear? That would be my question. Thank you.
Okay. Very good questions today. Thank you. So let's begin with the first one. I'll just quote, I don't know if I'll say, I'll just disagree or provide you with a different perspective that Freud provides us, and I'm going to send you to read it. Yes. So you'll see that in the paper on negation, Freud explicitly says that, well, repressed content is constituted from the get-go as repressed, as unconscious. It is not that something is conscious and then becomes unconscious. And I'll even say a side note here, psychoanalysis is not about making the unconscious conscious, right? It is when repression operates, it inscribes an element, what we might call an idea in Freudian terms, or a signifier in Lacanian terms, but let's call it an idea in Freudian terms. It constitutes this idea as unconscious from the get-go. Now you're going to say, I don't know if you're going to say this, but maybe you're going to say, well, but you know, if I repress something, if this is the case, then half of my reality would be out of the reach of consciousness. Here, a certain distinction has to be made, is the fact that when something is inscribed in the unconscious, and you'll notice that today I was trying to emphasize that. So when something is inscribed in the unconscious, it doesn't mean that it cannot be inscribed in consciousness as well, right? We have these, let's say, these common examples of a patient saying, I'm depressed, but I don't know why, on the one hand, right? Or a patient saying, well, I went to my mother's funeral, but I didn't feel anything, right? So we can see that ideas can have something to do with repression, can be constituted as unconscious, having these relations with other unconscious elements in the unconscious. Signifiers or ideas can still exist consciously. This means that the unconscious is a very unique type of space. It has a very unique type of ontology, right? I'm going here a little bit digressing into Zizek that talks about this, and he says that, well, it's not that it is about something that exists, let's say something that is conscious, so this is not the unconscious, and it is not something that doesn't exist, right? It is something in the middle, in between, suspended for eternity. This space of eternal suspension, we can associate this with the Christian conception of the limbo. Right? Now, you asked another question about hallucination and neurosis and psychosis. A terrific question. I would suggest reading a little bit from Bruce Fink about this in his paper, the Lacanian subject. But there's a terrific example he gives there that might help you with this question. He says, and that's very clear to me, that hallucination is not a strictly psychotic phenomenon. Neurotic people hallucinate sometimes, yes. And then we have to distinguish between a hallucination in neurosis and psychosis, and Lacan provides with some tools to do that. And Fink gives an example. The neurotic patient might go to, might go to church or the synagogue or the mosque and pray and experience a hallucination. God talked to him. He comes to analysis and he tells his analyst, look, yesterday God talked to me. But then he would say, well, God talked to me, but I'm not sure what he wants from me. Does he want me to be his messenger? Is this really the meaning of his words? I'm not sure. On the other hand, a psychotic that will experience the same kind of hallucination might come to analysis and say to the analyst, God talked to me yesterday, and I am sure that I am his messenger, right? This is the element that would distinguish the quality of hallucination. And you're talking to me about level of symptom, not of structure. But we can identify distinction here in terms of certainty, right? There is a certainty that is very much psychotic. What the psychotic subject is certain of is not the content of the message per se, right? Because we see psychotic patients wondering about the messages that they get, right? They are not necessarily sure what the message means. But what is certain is that the message was conveyed for the subject and it has a meaning that is particular to him. Yes, and I would say this is a way to differentiate psychosis and neurosis on the level of hallucination.
Hey, Leon. So I'm coming to you with a different question here. I'm very interested on how you would situate these different three perspectives that you describe of Freud's work, on how can we situate it with contemporary takes on psychosis. So we're pretty familiar with some of these different renderings. You offered us, for example, how that first reading ties up to Lacan's own approach to psychosis. But we also understand today that there's a variety of different accounts of psychosis, ranging from ordinary psychosis to notions like borderline personality disorder as a ways of trying to account for different ambiguities that have arisen in the field pertaining this. I guess my question to you is, how would you situate the insights that you have offered us here from Freud in the contemporary discourse pertaining psychosis?
You mean particularly in terms of borderline personality disorder and psychosis?
Not necessarily just that, just in terms of like, how do we see these insights that Freud gave us on psychosis back when, and how that has affected the development and formation different understandings of psychosis today? How would you situate Freud's understanding in a contemporary setting?
Yes. So first of all, I'll just comment before I answer your question that, well, today we presented Freud's perspective, and well, that's from a long time ago. We've made some headway since. Yes. The question is how to read Freud usefully, not how to justify Freud. And I think I also gave a certain critique of Freud's sort of concern with, particular concern with homosexuality in the paper on Schreber, and gave it sort of a different interpretation for today. You've mentioned Lacan, and we'll continue on that line. And I'd say that even Lacan, which started his career working with psychotic subjects, as some of you might know, Freud started with hysteric subjects, and Lacan started with psychotic subjects. His doctoral thesis concerned psychosis. And even in Lacan's teaching, we see drastic changes in the way that he talks about psychosis and the clinic of psychosis. So even in Lacan, we see changes which are relevant. And the later Lacan, in his idea of psychosis, in his engagement with the writings of James Joyce, is very different than this time that he talks about the name of the father, etc., etc. At the beginning, Lacan was thinking that there is only one delusion that we people all abide by. And in this sense, the psychotic is just not abiding by this one delusion. Later on, Lacan will talk about a multiplicity of delusions. And then, well, the question of instating a singular delusion. And I was touching that a little bit today. So I think that would be more relevant for today's clinic. What I would take from today's lecture and sort of say, well, let's work with that today. Let's take that from Freud. If you ask me, take two things and work with them. The first is the distinction between a structuring and a contingent causality in psychosis. And in that way, we can theorize and work with subjects that we assume are structured as psychotic, but did not suffer from an onset of psychosis. Yes, the clinic of psychosis is very much different than the clinic of neurosis. The position that the analyst takes is very different. And let's say these questions, these interpretations that might be used in cases of neurosis might be extremely harmful in cases of psychosis. And this is why this distinction between a structuring and a contingent causation is extremely important, because it is important for the subjects that we see in the clinic. The second conclusion that I will take from Freud today, generally from Freud metapsychology, and say that it's important to work with it today, goes against the notion of borderline personality disorder. What it particularly says or means is that when we have diagnostic categories, it is important that they will be singular, meaning that they will have a value of their own and, in a sense, not mesh up with other diagnostic categories, right? And in the Lacanian orientation, there is a very clear distinction between neurosis, perversion, psychosis, and I suggest autism, because each of these clinics is different, and it's important that it will be different. What I find with the notion of borderline personality disorder is a certain problematic, because I think that some patients that would abide by this category when we use I think I'm not sure if it's still in the DSM, I think it has changed a little bit, but when we diagnose that, some patients would, when we think about it psychoanalytically, would be more accurately described as being hysteric, and some other as being psychotic. And I always ask myself, you know, we should always ask ourselves, what is the use of a diagnostic category? And let me make a comment that might be a bit of a provocation. I would say that these structures, these subjective structures, only exist in the clinic. So in this sense, this notion of psychosis as a structure, neurosis as a structure, only has value when the analyst and the analysand meet in the clinic. It has value there because it helps the analyst direct the treatment, right? The treatment, not the patient, right? This is important to know. But when the patient leaves the clinic, when the analyst goes home, I would say, you know what? I don't know if they're psychotic. I don't know if they're neurotic. I don't know if they're autistic, because outside of the clinic, these categories lose their efficacy. They lose their value. We lose them. So in this sense, I would say that the fact that Freud insists on these distinct categories is an important thing. But then I would also add, again, being more contemporary today, that maybe we should restrict ourselves to using them in terms of the relationship between analyst and analysand. Maybe we hear Shaitan.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't work in psychoanalysis. I actually work in education, and I got a sort of query in some sense. It's a sort of simple thing. What I understood from the talk was that when the object libido fails, and it regresses back into the ego libido, there is a failure happening at the level of primal repression, not the repression proper.
Yes.
Is that the right way to think about this question? But if that is true, if and I can understand that in Freud there's a point where this proper repression only happens because the attraction towards primary repression that is taking place from the proper repression. That is how the secondary repression sort of takes place, and I understand that. But how does reality get implicated into the failure of primal repression? What is this link between the failure of primal repression and reality getting implicated into it? What is at stake in these two things? I can't get my head around it right now, actually. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you for this question. I'll just say we've talked about my book on autism, and I really go deeply into this question in the 3rd chapter of the book. And if you're interested, yeah, I would definitely urge you to get it. I'll just say that yes, primal repression is a mechanism that operates on the level of the drive. Yes, the drive also creates an inscription in the psyche. It is, Freud said, something that is between instinct and idea. It's not an idea, it's not this instinct that's sort of like incomprehensible, it's something in the middle. And what happens on primal repression is a certain inscription that creates a fixation. So drive operates in a certain way since. When we talk about the subject in psychoanalytic terms, we are talking, in fact, and even in terms of the treatment, we're talking about drive functioning, right? We many times say to our analysants, you know, this is not an intellectual process. You are not here to learn something intellectually. What we are aiming for is for a certain familiarity, a certain acquaintance with the object of psychoanalysis, the heterogeneous object of psychoanalysis, what Freud called the unconscious. But this encounter, this familiarity is established on the level of the body. Right? It's not on the level of the intellect. It's on the level of a change in the way that the drive operates, the way that the body operates and the symptom comes into being. I would say that an analysis is about gaining a conviction as to this familiarity, right? I am familiar with this change, and a change in someone's lives in terms of analysis is a change in drive functioning. Now, what I said today, and I hope this might in some way answer your question, is that primal repression for Freud, this is the theater, this is the time where something on the level of the drive is fixated, and from that day on decides and sets shapes, let's say, the subject's way of enjoyment, but also suffering, right? And well, secondary repression or repression proper is a way to deal with this particular form of suffering, right? And in psychosis, there are other ways to deal with it, like this type of secondary narcissism that Freud talked about, this redirecting of libido from the ego to the outside world. When we think about the subject in this way, then the clinic can direct itself to work that revolves this. It's a very good question. What to do with the drive, right? This is maybe the question in many different analyses. The answer, I won't give it today, and we'll stop here.